From the Netherlands, this is the Green Planet Monitor, voices and stories from a warm, wet planet. Today, the roots of the U.S. anti-abortion movement, misogyny, racism, hatred of immigrants.
People are recognizing that this is happening in the 19th century. There's lots of nativist fears, there's anti-immigrant sentiment, and there's this sense that if white Protestant Americans do not pick up the pace of having babies, we're going to be overrun by non-white ethnic groups. And so very much rooted in racism and even ideas about eugenics.
On the edge of a big Canadian city, an oasis of calm where wildlife thrives.
Where we are is so beautiful right now. It's amazing. If I took a photograph right now, we could be out in the wilderness. It's totally amazing. Like we're actually in the middle of a city of over 500,000 people with steel mills and train tracks and highways.
And the latest report from the World Meteorological Organization. Its lead author is scared.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years, and over those 20 years, these kinds of reports become more and more common. So I've kind of become inured to it a little bit. You kind of deal with it on a regular basis. You have to sort of accept this is happening to a certain extent, and it's a terrible thing.
This is the Green Planet Monitor. Before launching in, a request. Help us deliver this weekly package of Earth news. Subscribe and or donate at greenplanetmonitor.net. I'm David Kattenberg. The U.S. anti-abortion movement portrays itself as pro-life, pro-family, and conventionally conservative, whatever that may mean. Not far beneath the surface, however, something darker bubbles, a wellspring of misogyny, racism, hatred of immigrants, and antipathy for individual freedom of all sorts. Among these, the freedom of a woman to control her own body. With me to talk about the history of women's reproductive rights is Lauren McIver Thompson. Lauren Thompson is an assistant professor of history at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, Georgia, and a historian of early 20th century women's rights and public health at Georgia State University College of Law's Center for Law, Health, and Society. I've been reading some of your writings, and you refer, Lauren Thompson, to false histories of abortion. And you write, quote, "Our ignorance of this history, of the history of abortion, and of women's reproductive health by extension, equips those in the anti-abortion movement with power to create dangerous narratives," unquote. How so? How are we ignorant of the history of abortion?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, there's a sense that, if you ask the average person on the street, they think that abortion and birth control are something new. And so that, I think, positions people who have religious objections to birth control and abortion in very particular ways, because it allows them to say, look, this is a problem of modernity, and it's because our world today is so corrupt and immoral. But the truth is, obviously, birth control and abortion go back to the earliest human societies. We know from, ancient Egyptian archaeology, the kinds of contraceptives they were using. There's references to abortion all throughout the ancient world. And so this is not a new phenomenon, but I think that there's also the idea that, in addition to it not being common in the past, that everyone was against it in the past, and that's why they outlawed it. And so that is not true either, because the physicians who were working to get the state laws that were passed in the 19th century were sometimes motivated by ideas that abortion was murder and therefore immoral, but they were also equally motivated by other things like anti-immigrant sentiment, racism, the idea that women should not be participating in politics in the public sphere, and therefore, abortion was particularly immoral for women because it was having them neglect their duties of motherhood. And so there are a variety of sort of myths floating around about abortion history that I think are getting now incorporated literally into our court system, because they're getting these lies are getting incorporated into, for example, Dobbs majority opinion that was issued last summer. I mean, Justice Alito says that the physicians who passed this law were motivated by the idea that abortion is murder and that life begins at conception. And he also says that, if Americans really hadn't wanted to legalize abortion, they would have presumably voted against these laws in their legislatures. He conveniently leaves out the fact that women did not have the vote until 1920, and the vast majority of these laws were passed between 1850 and 1900. So there's really just sort of a variety of myths floating around that I think are really shaping our political discourse and even in our judicial discourse about abortion.
And Justice Alito in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization refers to, and I pulled this from one of your articles. I haven't read the majority opinion itself, but he apparently refers to, quote, domestic supply of babies, right? Opposing abortion because it stands in the way of or interferes with the domestic supply of babies. And then he goes back to 13th century English case law. Yes.
I mean, first of all, for him to bring up the domestic supply of infants is, he's really fitting in there with the exact arguments that were made about or for outlawing abortion in the 19th century. Of course, physicians and ministers and reformers who were in support of passing strict abortion laws, again, wanted white Protestant native-born women to have more babies than they were having. There was a very steep fertility decline, since about the Revolutionary War up through the early part of the 20th century. I mean, it was the average number of children that a family has drops from somewhere between 7 and 9 to somewhere between 3 and 4. And that's a pretty big drop overall. And so then by World War II, many families mostly only have 2 to 3 children. And so people are recognizing that this is happening in the 19th century, and there's lots of nativist fears, there's anti-immigrant sentiment, and there's this sense that if white Protestant Americans do not pick up the pace of having babies, we're going to be overrun by non-white ethnic groups. And so very much rooted in racism and even ideas about eugenics.
Let's come back to this, but how far back do your own historical studies go? I've been just scanning some of the literature, the popular literature, Scientific American amongst them, on the internet, about views that prevailed about contraception and abortion going back to the early Christian era, when some of the Christian fathers spoke out quite openly about the right of women and the necessity of women to be able to control their own fertility and to have abortions. Although the positions were very complex, and there were different perspectives about women who were from lower realms of life, prostitution, but also women of higher stature and rank. And there were all sorts of methods of contraception being used, and abortion, and even I've read about late-term abortion.
There is a lot of history, and my expertise is really more on the 19th and 20th century United States, but I do know some of the kinds of things that they would do, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So we're looking at things like using astringent douching mechanisms after sex. I mean, that's a very old method that carries right up through the 20th century. They had pessaries that they would insert. Often they would, make some kind of powdered tablet that they would insert into the vagina that presumably was supposed to prevent pregnancy, or either right just before or right after intercourse. There are a variety of herbs and plants that were known to bring on abortion, such as tansy, rue, savin, black cohosh. I mean, some of these plants are more native to the Americas. And so Native Americans here in what is now North America would have had a long history and understanding of knowing what kinds of plants or herbs to use. But in Europe, they had similar kind of lore about what herbs and plants you could grow in the garden to bring on the menses. Because a lot of times women who had not gotten a period might not even understand themselves to be pregnant. They instead were focusing on the idea that, oh, my period hasn't started, something must be wrong. But it wasn't necessarily pregnancy. But so, in the medieval, early modern period, and really up until, I would argue, the end of the 19th century, even in the United States, there was the idea that you had to start your period through one of these methods, whether it was drinking a special tea or taking a pill that made out of these herbal concoctions. And of course, these things were not super safe because nothing was regulated. And so if you took too much of these things, you could die, you could get poisoning. But that is not to say that women didn't use these things and really understood the idea that pregnancy was not something that was really real to them until they could feel the baby move. And so there are, and surgical abortion, in the past, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, I'm sure we have accounts of that. I can't imagine that it was very safe in the past before, antiseptics. But by the middle of the 19th century, as medicine does start to advance just a little bit, surgical abortion did gain some popularity, especially in the United States. And so, but the vast majority of abortion probably was chemically induced, medically induced, not surgical. And, really that's a parallel to today, because the vast majorities of abortion in the United States now are from medication abortion, from mifepristone and misoprostol, the protocol that's under attack right now from the Texas district court. And so that's something that is kind of in common. It's been, the vast majority of abortions take place in the first trimester. But of course, surgical techniques have advanced. Abortion now, surgical abortion is very, very safe. It's safer than a 9-month pregnancy and labor and delivery.
And so in the 17th and 18th century in America, the 18th century, abortion was legal under common law.
Yes, it was. There were no laws about abortion at all. And the idea was that if they could prove infanticide, that was something different. But often the line between miscarriage, abortion, and infanticide was pretty blurred. And so often what you find in these early court cases dealing with abortion is that they're being punished under adultery laws, or like laws about not having sex outside of marriage, or and so that they're not really concerned necessarily about the abortion. It's more just like that's a result of something sinful that they did. So they're more concerned about the immorality of the sex than they are the immorality of the abortion itself. And we see that repeatedly in early court cases. And of course, by the time you get to the 19th century, we do begin to see prosecutions based on state abortion laws, but for most of them, they're often going after the person performing the abortion, less so than the woman who was seeking to have an abortion.
And prior to the 19th century, was it the view that women had the right to control their own bodies?
Yeah, there was really kind of a sense, I think, in the 18th century, especially in the colonial United States, that women had a essential right to the integrity of their own body. I mean, it was not something that I think men really thought about. That was women's work. That was women's job. I mean, you gave birth at home with a midwife. I mean, the midwife would perform an abortion for you if you needed it, or help address a miscarriage, that kind of thing. And so I think that the absence of, one of Justice Alito's tenets in the opinion to argue to return abortion to the states is, he said something like, since it wasn't in the Constitution, clearly they didn't want to make it legal, but that the absence of a mention of abortion in the Constitution doesn't really mean much because I think it was something that they just considered a part of everyday life. And unless you were a person who performed an abortion and ended up killing the woman, I mean, that was something different, right? That could be prosecuted as murder. But if you performed successful abortions, in the second trimester, or even late term abortions, I don't know how common those were, but I'm sure they happened. If the woman lived and went on to live her life, nothing might happen to you legally.
So what happened in the 20th century, or should I say in the 19th century, and focus on let's cut to the chase here, the Comstock Act of 1873. What was that all about? Tell us about the Comstock Act and what impact it had on women's right to terminate pregnancies.
Yeah, so by the time that Anthony Comstock, who's a vice reformer from New York, he is very concerned about prostitution and pornography and sexual material and the red light districts in New York. And he is working alongside the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, to kind of clean up the streets of New York. He raids brothels, he raids bars, he raids bookshops that are selling, dirty material, that kind of thing. So, but he ends up going to Washington, D.C. with trunkfuls of confiscated items that he then puts on display for the senators and representatives in Congress. And they set up some kind of exhibit like in the vice president's office in Congress. And of course, the congressmen go by and kind of gawk at things. And, in the winter of 1873, they draft this bill in committee, and it gets pretty quickly sent out to the floor and passed. And, and then it goes on to the House of Representatives, where it's passed with even less discussion. And the congressional record indicates that, there was actually a few senators asking, wait a minute, what are we voting for? What is this? And there's the sense that it's kind of chaotic. It's late at night. They don't know, they're like, oh, fine, just pass it, and one senator says, I hope we're not going to regret this or something to that effect. But then the law had a lot of teeth. I think that senator was very prescient because the 1873 Comstock law, it layered on top of a whole set of state abortion laws. It layers another set of legal ramifications on abortion. It classifies anything having to do with abortion or birth control as obscenity, alongside pornography, sexual material, that kind of thing.
And what was the underlying rationale? What was it obscene about it? Was it that it was unchristian or immoral, or that the unborn had a right to life, or was there something more associated with this idea, getting back to Samuel Alito conjuring this up about the supply of babies, the supply of white babies?
Yes. I think almost all of those things. I have not seen anything where Comstock in particular is really talking about a fetal right to life. I haven't seen him voice anything really like that, but in other interviews I've seen him, or in writings that he produced at the time, he talks about how all of anything having to do with sex, outside of marriage or beyond procreative sex is immoral. And so there's the push to establish what obscenity was in the late 19th century is really big. It comes out of a Protestant element that is very strong in American history, obviously dating back to the Puritans. And it's a reaction to a lot of the social transformations that are taking place in that period. I mean, this is post-Civil War, post-emancipation. It's the height of, as suffrage really starts to ramp up and women are appearing in the public sphere, they're attending college, they're attending graduate school. And there's a lot of social change and transformation happening. And I think that people like Comstock were sort of desperate to reestablish some kind of moral order. And so that was really the impetus for the Comstock laws. There was a virtual army of postal inspectors that were appointed to this special office in the post office that they were responsible for searching through people's mails to see if they were mailing anything obscene or indecent.
Searching for pennyroyal.
So it could be anything from mailing abortifacients to someone to mailing a pornographic magazine. Like, I mean, it was sort of all treated the same.
And where did fear of immigration fit in here? Because late 19th century waves of immigrants coming to the United States. So where did that fit in?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're seeing a shift in the kind of groups of immigrants that are coming over to the US in this period. You know, in the 1830s, 1840s, it's mostly Irish, German, Northern European. And then we get this shift to not only Southern and Eastern European immigrants, but also Asian immigrants, particularly, you know, Chinese laborers who are coming over to work in the West on the railroad. And so America is really rapidly transforming. There's a lot of physical movement, you know, happening. And I think that this is also the period where eugenics begins its ascent in American thought. It was an incredibly popular and deeply respected science. I mean, we tend to think of eugenics as junk science. It's bad science. It's not that's what Nazis do, but eugenics was embedded in every aspect of American life practically. You could see advertising for eugenic hats or eugenic shampoo, you know, if you open up late 19th century, early 20th century newspapers. So there's this idea, it all does kind of go back to the idea that the white race needs to figure out, or white native born Protestant race, you know, needs to figure out the best way to maintain supremacy.
Throughout all this period that we're talking about, it became harder for women to obtain contraceptives or to have abortions carried out. I don't want to say safe abortions, because I'm sure a lot of them weren't safe at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I certainly think that the Comstock Act, combined with those state level anti-contraceptive and anti-abortion laws, they certainly had a chilling effect. It was very shameful. You know, people who did seek abortion, you know, knew, oh, you know, I could get in big trouble for this. People who performed abortion, same thing. But at the same time, the proliferation of advertising in newspapers and magazines for contraceptives and abortifacients is really mind-boggling. You open up any late 19th century newspaper and you're going to see advertisements for pennyroyal pills, you know, female doctoresses, you know, who are open for business on the corner, you know, like they advertise these things in newspapers because, you know, it was, again, a common feature of life. We begin to see court cases in the early 20th century that, you know, the Comstock Act targets these advertisers. They target the manufacturers of these medicines, these patent medicines, but they're starting to win in court.
Where does the emergence of professionalized obstetrics and gynecology fit in within the medical profession? The medical profession is becoming more professional, and you're getting professionalized obstetrics and gynecology, and you get men providing women with health care and health services rather than women providing women with those services themselves. How does this figure in?
Yeah, that's a big transition, as you said, that takes place over the course of the 19th century. So women, the vast majority of births by about 1920 are taking place in the hospital. Obstetrics and gynecology is a very respected profession. And so you do have physicians, though, by the 1920s who are coming out and openly saying that birth control is part of public health. It's part of medical practice. They're not making the same arguments about abortion, but that's because most of the people who supported legalized contraception had this very firm idea that if birth control was just legal for everyone, then abortions really won't be necessary. I mean, maybe occasionally for a medical reason, but other than that, nobody will be needing an abortion as a remedy for a pregnancy that they don't want. And instead, everyone can just prevent the pregnancy in the first place. And so you do get very prominent physicians who begin to, you know, represent organizations like the American Birth Control League. You know, they have a medical director who goes around and gives talks to hospitals and public health organizations and even the general public, and says, this is why contraception is important. So by the middle to late 1930s, and I would say into the 1940s, you really have a lot of physicians who are very much on board with birth control, who prescribe it to their patients. There are birth control clinics that open where patients who can't necessarily afford private medical care, they can go and get fitted for a diaphragm or a pessary. And so there are very much expanding clinical opportunities to obtain birth control. Now, that being said, I think that we start to really see illegal abortion kind of, even as contraception is becoming more widely available, the stigma around abortion remains, and you continue to have a lot of women who end up in the hospital because of septic abortions that have gone wrong, self-induced abortions, right? Because there's still, like, even as contraception is becoming more accepted, it's still stigmatized. It's still something that is taboo somewhat to talk about. And so by the 1950s, you just got a very high rate of illegal abortions. You have whole wards in hospitals that are specifically devoted to treating women who have gone septic or who are hemorrhaging after a botched abortion. And by the middle of the 60s, I mean, that's really when a lot of the stories that kind of galvanized the American public to rally around support for abortion rights. I mean, people are outraged at seeing photographs of women lying in pools of blood in hotel rooms and things like that. And that really kind of puts the issue forefront, and people begin to realize, both of these things have to be legal in order to have appropriate reproductive health care as a public health measure.
And the birth control movement in the, I guess in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, this is a quote from yourself, became yet another catalyst in expanding and solidifying racist and paternalist decision-making in American medicine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, nothing is ever just one simple story, right? So yes, expanding birth control access, but at the same time, physicians who are supporting birth control often have very eugenic ideas about who should use it, right? So it does fit into the sterilization movement, lots and lots of poor white women, for example, in the Midwest being sterilized, and poor Black women in states like North Carolina or Alabama being sterilized, certainly Latino women in places like California, Native American women living on reservations. There's a push by a lot of white American medicine to ensure that, again, only the right kind of people are having babies. And so there's forced contraception, forced sterilization that takes place that's legal under the 14th Amendment. Buck v. Bell, the case in 1928, says that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes says, in the interest of saving the race and creating a fit, having the most fit race, right? We can sterilize people who should not be having children. And so birth control has always been a huge legal and social paradox, because it represents freedom, it represents self-determination, it represents feminism, it represents all of those things. But on the other hand, in our history, it also represents the racist schisms, the paternalistic kind of regime that America existed and it continues to exist under. So it means many things at the same time, and that's why this question is so complicated.
And Justice Blackmun's majority opinion in Roe versus Wade refutes that abortion is a woman's absolute right. It's not an absolute right that women have. It's the domain of medicine.
Yes. Yeah. So there's this push to link contraception and abortion with medicine. And on the one hand, that is good because it makes things safer. It makes things more regulated. That's not a bad thing. But as we have seen over the last, 8 decades in our country, the fact that even as it became part of medicine, it also became siloed away from regular medicine. So by like in the post-Roe era, that's why you have abortion clinics instead of like your regular OBGYN just performing it in the office. There's this push to bring this stuff in within medicine so that they can control it. And then there's a kind of a siloing of it over the last 30, 40 years. And that's, I think, explains a lot about how we have ended up where we have ended up today, because mainstream physicians are not the ones performing abortions. It was never normalized within medical training after Roe. And so there's all kinds of things going on here.
Lauren McIver Thompson is an assistant professor of history at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, Georgia, and a historian of early 20th century women's rights and public health at Georgia State University College of Law's Center for Law, Health, and Society. We'll link to several of her scholarly and media pieces about women's reproductive rights at greenplanetmonitor.net. You are listening to the Green Planet Monitor. If you're appreciating what you're hearing, go to greenplanetmonitor.net and subscribe, or donate, or both. With your generous help, we'll keep delivering Earth stories to listen to, read, and watch. Intact natural ecosystems are home to a wide range of plants and animals. Cities are ecosystems too. The healthiest ones coexist with nature. On the edge of one of Canada's largest cities, the benefits provided by natural ecosystems and the importance of protecting them are on full display. Here's a story from Hamilton, Ontario, a place called Cootes Paradise. I'm standing on the edge of a 4-lane highway on the edge of the city of Hamilton, on the western tip of Lake Ontario, the heart of urban Canada. Cars and trucks barrel east to Toronto and Montreal, and south to Niagara Falls, Detroit, and beyond. A few hundred yards away, gazing in the opposite direction, something much more tranquil. An open expanse of blue water bounded by green forest. This is Cootes Paradise, the largest patch of intact coastal wetland on the western end of Lake Ontario. Cootes Paradise is an oasis of silence and nature. In the heart of the city, it's an intact ecosystem where wildlife thrives and humans seek refuge from the urban grind.
Where we are is so beautiful right now. It's amazing.
David Mivasayer paddles Cootes in his canoe.
I moved here from Vancouver, which people say is one of the most beautiful cities in the world and so spectacular. But Hamilton, even though it's a very industrial port city, is also so beautiful. I can't believe where we are right now.
And if you were to take away the sound of the Highway 403 and the cars, you'd think you were in the middle of kind of nowhere.
It does look that way, sure. If I took a photograph right now, we could be out in the wilderness. It's totally amazing. Like, we're actually in the middle of a city of over 500,000 people. There's steel mills and train tracks and highways.
In the South Shore, in the Cootes, we have found at least 80 species of fresh mushrooms. So it's very diverse.
On the forested south shore of Cootes Paradise, Shanping Xu is content searching for fungi. JP, as he's called, is a biologist at McMaster University overlooking Cootes Marsh. According to JP, fungal diversity in Cootes is on par with some of North America's most intact forests.
Over here, there's a very interesting mushroom.
JP and I bend down to take a close look at the mushroom. Then, a tiny surprise. Well, there's a little frog. There's a little frog.
Yeah, look at this one. Isn't that pretty?
JP is more interested in the mushroom. He's got a permit to explore Coutts, including areas closed to the public, and he very much appreciates the importance of this place.
The ecological niche is actually very, very suitable for a lot of growth. There's a lot of water. The topography is quite diverse. So it's a very, very good place for a lot of organisms, but it's also a good place for us humans to enjoy.
They don't call it a paradise for nothing.
They don't call paradise for nothing, yes.
Coutts surely was a paradise back in the 1780s when British Army officer Thomas Coote hunted and fished here. Since then, urban expansion, soot from Hamilton's famed iron and steel works, and climate change have all taken their toll. 20 years of restoration work has paid off. And here's a trail we used to take along. It's not a trail, it's a sanctuary area, it says.
Yes, that's right. So this is one of the little pockets of lovely habitat in front of us. But it's only lovely habitat if it's not full of people.
Tice Teismeyer is head of natural areas for the Royal Botanical Gardens, the organization that manages Coutts. Today, old trails are off limits. Rewilding, it's called. Now, some people might ask, what's the point of having natural area if people can't go into it?
Yes, well, you're into the number one challenge with the planet. If I can't use it all, what's the point? That's all there is.
Tice and I walk through intact Carolinian forest. Walnut, black cherry, tulip, butternuts, and sassafras abound. And here's a big old tree.
Yeah, this is one of the survivors beside us. It's a red oak, almost a meter across, and stands probably 120 feet tall.
A half dozen creeks feed cold spring water into Coutts. Sewer runoff from West Hamilton has been greatly reduced. This water is pretty clean. Tice and I walk between forest and creek. Coutts is home to 1,000 plant species and lots of birds. Some hang out here on their long journey between Alaska and southern Chile. But one species of wildlife, a fish, has been most unwelcome, the common carp. Introduced at a hatchery on the north shore of Lake Ontario, huge carp soon invaded Coutts, ripping out marsh roots with their sucker mouths, blasting sediment, and driving out native fish. By 1960, most of Coutts Marsh was laid to waste. In 1997, a steel structure was erected across the channel between Coutts and Hamilton Harbor. Coutts Fishway lets native fish come and go, keeps the carp out.
I mean, we'll definitely be seeing some carp trying to get in, and we'll keep them on the Hamilton Harbor side at least.
Every Friday, Nick Bendo and other Royal Botanical Gardens staff sort through their fishway's catch. Those carp are
That was a carp.
pretty active.
And they're very splashy, so you're usually going to get wet.
Having eliminated carp, the next step was restoring Coutts Marsh, replanting cattails, water lily, and wild rice. This little marsh wren couldn't be happier, perched and singing in the sunshine. Nearby, great blue herons, snowy white egrets, bitterns, terns, and kingfishers abound. So do beavers, muskrats, and deer. On the edge of a large city, the Coutts Paradise looks like an intact ecosystem. And urban dwellers like David Mivisere are part of that ecosystem. They benefit too.
Well, it's really important, I think, for our mental health and spiritual balance. Also, I'm sure it provides things like fresh air. These are things for scientists. But for me, I just feel it. If you live in the city, you can be in contact with something that's not completely run by humans.
For more information about Coutts Paradise, go to greenplanetmonitor.net. While you're there, subscribe. For $5 or more, you'll be helping to make this news package happen. You are listening to the Green Planet Monitor. I'm David Kattenberg. You gotta laugh to keep from crying sometimes. The bluesman who wrote those words could have had today's climate news in mind. Epic rains and floods from Somalia to South Asia, savage wildfires in Spain and the western Canadian province of Alberta, eye-popping heat in Vietnam and Thailand that actually kills. Last year was Europe's hottest ever, swept by heat waves that killed an estimated 20,000. And greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. Methane, more powerful than CO2, reached its highest recorded level. So did the energy content of Earth's oceans, where 90% of atmospheric heat ends up. As oceans heat, they expand. Ocean levels reached a record high in 2022, and their rate of rise has doubled since satellite records began. Fast-melting glaciers accelerate the rate of rising seas. All this 2 years into what would normally be a cooling La Niña phase. As warmer El Niño conditions take over, the next few years promise to be even warmer, pushing Earth's surface temperatures above 1.5 degrees, the target that was set at the Paris talks in 2016. These are the findings of the World Meteorological Organization in its State of the Global Climate Report for 2022. I spoke with the report's lead author, John Kennedy. How do you respond to reports like this? It's scary. People can't survive at temperatures of this sort.
Yeah, I've been doing this for 20 years, and over those 20 years, these kinds of reports become more and more common. So I've kind of become inured to it a little bit. You kind of deal with it on a regular basis. You have to sort of accept this is happening to a certain extent, and it's a terrible thing. The heat waves in Europe last year, which are in the State of the Climate reports, where they've actually assessed the number of deaths. I think there were 15,000 or so across the 4 or 5 countries that had made that assessment. Excess deaths, they say, and it all adds up. And when you start compiling these figures, it really is, it's horrifying in a very specific kind of way. People talk about statistics being rather bland and abstract somehow, but all of those things, all of those numbers represent something, a lot of personal and individual tragedies, which really kind of adds up psychically, I guess.
And speaking of, extreme heat events and heat waves, I mean, according to your report, the State of the Global Climate for 2022, in Europe, across Europe, there was an excess number of deaths of over 15,000 people. So an estimated 15,000 or more actually died in 2022 as the result of heat.
Yeah. And that's just in the countries that have done that calculation. So 15,000 is probably an underestimate for the continent as a whole.
Let's go through some of the numbers, John Kennedy, in your State of the Global Climate, or the WMO's State of the Global Climate report for 2022, of which you were the lead author. Global mean temperature, global mean surface temperature on Earth. How much has it risen post-industrial?
In 2022, the annual mean was about 1.2 degrees, and that's pretty close to the overall warming since pre-industrial times, I think, as the IPCC calculated it. It's about 1.2 degrees, I think.
Increase in global average temperature, mean temperature since post-industrial, 1.15 degrees.
That's just for the one single year. Yeah, the 2022 is slightly cooler than kind of recent years because of La Niña. It's been a big effect on climate this year and last year. 2022 and 2021. But yeah, the long-term warming, if you smooth out those ups and downs from El Nino and La Nina, is around 1.1, 1.2 degrees.
Now, some people would think, geez, that's not a lot, right? Global mean surface temperature since the Industrial Revolution has risen around 1.15 degrees. That's pretty small.
It does sound small, but we're used to, I guess, daily variations in temperature at a particular place. And 1 degree, okay, that might not seem much compared to the daily cycle. We're talking about the whole planet. It takes a lot to warm up the whole planet by 1 degree. We don't have the intuition to tell us what that really means. So the amount of energy that's accumulating in the oceans, when we're putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, they're trapping energy. That's what warms the Earth up. And most of that's going into the oceans. And that's 90% of that energy goes into the oceans. And they've warmed by a number that's 1 followed by 21 zeros in terms of joules.
The temperature of the ocean.
Yeah, the actual energy in the ocean, and measure it in joules. Like you might, measure the amount of energy in your food using kilojoules or calories. It's the same kind of measure of energy. And it's a simply phenomenal number. So depending on how you look at it, it can seem like an absolutely gigantic thing. Or if you just look at what the temperature changes, it might seem very small because we don't have that intuition for what it means to warm a whole planet based on our own personal experience of, going outside and looking at a thermometer.
So 2022 was a year of, 2022 compared to past years was how warm was Earth's surface compared to past years or past reference decades in 2022, and how much higher could that have been if we had been in the midst of El Nino?
So depending which data set you look at, it was the 5th or 6th warmest year since 1850, back when the first instrumental global measurements are available. And the past 8 years now are the 8 warmest years on record. So everything 2022 was warmer than anything prior to 2014, basically. So it's very warm in the long-term context. If you look back 165 years of the record, then it's a very warm year in that context. But compared to like a year like 2016, which was boosted, the global temperature was boosted by a strong El Nino, then it's a bit cooler. And if we do have an El Nino maybe later this year or next year or in the next few years, then we're likely to see temperatures, which are very close to, if not exceeding, the current record globally.
Let's talk about greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas levels continue to rise. How high did greenhouse gas levels rise in 2021? And is the rate of rise increasing? And I understand that methane, for example, which isn't that long-lived, but is amongst the more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, in 2020, 2021 measured the highest annual rise of methane.
Yeah. So for each of those 3 gases that you mentioned, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, they each reached record levels in 2021, which is the last year for which we've got the consolidated global numbers. And they probably reached record levels again in 2022. The rate of change for carbon dioxide has increased over time. So the annual growth rate has kind of gradually increased as emissions have increased. But also you get year-to-year variations in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because as we go from El Nino to La Nina, the capacity of the Earth to absorb that carbon dioxide is altered. So during El Nino, the what they call the sinks, which are absorbing some of that carbon dioxide, are less effective. So you see a peak in the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere and staying there. And during La Nina, you get a slight reduction. But overall, if you even out those ups and downs from El Nino and La Nina, we're seeing an increase in the carbon dioxide growth rate over time. For nitrous oxide, there's been similarly an increase in the growth rate over the past 40 or so years. So we actually saw the growth rate for that being a record also in 2020, 2021. Methane is less well understood. The rate of increase of methane, going back to the 1980s when we have these global measurements, started off rather steep and then it leveled off between maybe 1990 and 2010 or thereabouts. And then since then it's ramped up again. And the rate in the past 2 years has been particularly high.
Let's talk about the oceans. Ocean temperature, the temperature of the oceans that absorb 90% of the heat atmospheric heat that we're generating with these greenhouse gas emissions, 90% of it goes into the oceans, which makes the oceans expand, and so sea level is rising. What are the trends? What were the trends in 2021, 2022, with respect to ocean temperature and sea level?
So in terms of ocean heat, first, that's one of the primary measures of global warming. It reached record high levels again in 2022, as it did in 2021 and 2020. We see a very kind of, in terms of ocean heat content, where we're measuring the temperature of the ocean down to a depth of 2 kilometers using a variety of automated buoys. We see a kind of more or less steady rise in the ocean heat that's being driven by the increases in greenhouse gases. And because we're seeing that steady increase in temperature of the oceans down to a depth of 2 kilometers, we're also seeing a rather steady rise in terms of sea level as well. So sea level also reached record high levels in 2022. And for sea level, we're using satellite altimeters, so bouncing radar waves off the surface of the ocean to measure the sea surface height. And we have very good global measurements of that going back to 1993. And so since then, there's been a clear increase. And also, the past decade, the rate of sea level rise has been higher than it was in the first decade of that record.
It doubled. The rate of sea level rise doubled between 1993, 2002, and 2013, 2022.
Yeah, it doubled.
So it's now rising at about, 4.6 millimeters a year, which again, people may think, geez, 4.6 millimeters a year, what's that? But if you multiply that by 10 in a decade, it'll be like, And
in a century, it'll be even more. Yeah, it all adds up. And this is the thing, it's with sea level as well, is even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow, the oceans will continue to warm for a long time, and sea level will continue to rise for not just decades, but potentially centuries. So it's something that's, if you're looking further into the future, sea level is something that's very hard to, sea level change is something that's very, very hard to avoid. I mean, in the past 30 years of that satellite record as well, that acceleration is coming from not just the increased heat in the oceans, but also the melting of ice on land. So the acceleration is partly driven by increased losses from large amounts of ice in the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, which are also, of course, a symptom of the overall warming.
Now, in your report, you talk about reference glaciers and the rate at which they're losing mass, they're melting. Where are these reference glaciers, and what did they do in 2021, 2022?
These are glaciers with long-term measurements lasting 30 years or more, which have been regularly measured. And they're from 19 or so different high mountain regions around the world. So they're grouped together in areas where they're geographically related kind of areas of glaciation. And in 2022, we saw very high losses across those reference glaciers. So I think it's one of the 5 most rapid ice losses for the year 2022. And obviously over time, we've seen an increase in the rates of ice loss from those glaciers, those reference glaciers, with the past decade being particularly rapid losses. But of course, there's variations in how much glaciers in different regions behaved in the year. So we've seen some areas where there were gains. For example, Norway and Iceland. I saw some mass gain in glaciers. They had relatively cool and wet summers, so there was some snow to replenish the glaciers. But in other parts of Europe, for example, the Alps, there were incredible losses of ice. Switzerland, I think, lost around 6% of its remaining glacial volume in that 1 year. So overall, there's been large and increasing glacier mass losses around the world, but there's still some local variation.
Do the results of your latest report worry you, John Kennedy? It's a personal question.
I've been asked this question several times on the back of this report. And like I said at the start, I've been doing this for going on 20 years now. And worry is, okay, one of the emotions that you feel from time to time, but also there's, frustration, because we present this information, sometimes it falls on deaf ears, sometimes it doesn't. So there's hope as well. It's, there's a variety of emotions that go into it, but it's kind of sad, really, to see the vulnerability of people around the world to weather and climate events in general. When we're putting this together, we gather this information about how the weather and climate has affected people. And that's kind of the thing that resounds with me for the longest time, is that sadness, really, that we could do more. And there's more we could do to help and even save people from what's going on.
But at the current rate of change, moving forward, projecting forward a decade, 50 years, 100 years, reports like this certainly give cause to worry and to wonder whether or not one should be bringing children into the world. This is something that I'm sure you may have personal opinion about. It's not the province of the World Meteorological Organization to make moral or political or cultural statements, but it's very scary for some and for many, I guess.
Yeah, I can understand that. The changes seem big and many people feel that out of their control. But I think the important thing to remember is that we can do things. It is possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It requires concerted and global action, but it's not beyond us.
John Kennedy is the chair of the World Meteorological Organization's expert team on climate monitoring and assessments, and the lead author of its annual Global Climate Report for 2022. We'll link to that report at greenplanetmonitor.net. That's it for today's GPM, coming to you from Earth Chronicle Productions, Breda in the Netherlands. Listen, read, and watch more Earth stories at greenplanetmonitor.net. And please support independent Earth journalism. Subscribe to the GPM at greenplanetmonitor.net. By the way, the guy behind this guitar is Dan Weisenberger. Thanks for the wonderful theme music, Dan. I'm David Kattenberg. Over and out for now.